Hi, I'm Steve Pellett, and I'm the Legal Strategy Director at the International Refugee Assistance Project and a visiting clinical lecturer in law at Yale Law School. Together with my colleague and co-lecturer, Julie Kornfeld, we will briefly introduce and discuss the United States Refugee Admissions Program, or USRAP for short. USRAP is the US government program to resettle refugees from overseas into the United States. USRAP is a humanitarian expression of US domestic and foreign policy interests. It is related to but distinct from the asylum process, a system by which refugees at the border or within the United States may seek protection. Today, we will briefly cover the main laws and regulations that govern USRAP, and then walk through how refugees apply for resettlement to the United States. The modern USRAP came into existence with the passing of the Refugee Act of 1980. The relevant sections of this law are part of the Immigration and Nationality Act, or INA. Two important sections of the INA for understanding USRAP are Section 101, which defines the term refugee, and Section 207, which sets out how the number of refugees who are admitted to the US each year through USRAP is determined. First, a key part of Section 101 is the INA's definition of a refugee, which states that a refugee is any person who is outside of any country of such person's nationality, or in the case of a person having no nationality, is outside of any country in which such person last habitually resided, and who is unable or unwilling to return to, and is unable or unwilling to avail himself or herself of the protection of that country because of persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. This part of the definition is based on the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees and its 1967 protocols. The United States signed the latter in 1968. Unlike the 1951 Convention and its protocols, US law allows for individuals within their country of nationality or habitual residence to be considered refugees in certain circumstances. Similar but distinct from the 1951 Convention, the INA also excludes individuals from refugee protection, with the INA excluding individuals who participated in the persecution of others, and the Convention excluding individuals who committed a crime against peace, a war crime, or a crime against humanity. There is a lot of complexity in the refugee definition that other resources and treatises can help you explore. But now we want to move on to Section 207 of the INA, where Congress established how the number of refugees resettled through USRAP would be determined each year. Section 207 states in part, the number of refugees who may be admitted shall be such number as the President determines before the beginning of the fiscal year and after appropriate consultation is justified by humanitarian concerns or is otherwise in the national interest. Under the INA, the President determines the number, but only after consultation with Congress. In this graph, which shows the annual ceiling of refugee admissions set by the consultative process in blue, as well as the number of admitted refugees in orange, you can see that the admissions numbers over time and the historic low point reached under the Trump administration. Section 207 of the INA does not include a detailed mandate for the structure or operations of USRAP, instead stating in part that subject to the numerical limitations, the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security may admit any refugee who is not firmly resettled in any foreign country, is determined to be of special humanitarian concern to the United States, and is admissible. The regulations governing USRAP are primarily found in the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR, and 8 CFR 207. They contain some additional requirements, including that applicants appear at an interview before an immigration officer and complete medical exams, but they are spare in comparison to the more detailed regulations governing asylum. Neither the statutes nor the regulations specifically detail how the US determines which of the nearly 30 million refugees are of special humanitarian concern to the United States, or how refugees who have faced persecution can practically file an application. Some of this information can be found in the annual report to Congress from the various agencies that administer USRAP. Refugee Council USA, a coalition of organizations advocating for refugees, also maintains public information on the process on their website. So how does a refugee apply for refugee resettlement to the United States? I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Julie, to walk you through that process.
Thanks, Steve. Now that we have an understanding of the statutory background of USRAP, I'm going to walk us through how it operates in practice. In order to apply to USRAP, individuals must first establish themselves within one of the 3 priority categories. This is a limitation that prevents most refugees from accessing the program. So let's walk through those priority categories. First, priority 1 is reserved for individual case referrals. This means that select refugees are referred by either UNHCR, or the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, a U.S. embassy, or a designated NGO. Most referrals are from UNHCR, which assists the U.S. throughout the world in identifying individuals. In practice, how this works is that a refugee will approach UNHCR, they'll register, and they'll undergo an adjudication by UNHCR to determine whether they are a refugee and to see if they meet UNHCR's resettlement criteria. This process of UNHCR identifying and referring refugees leads to referrals for less than 1 in 100 refugees. Next, priority 2 is for groups identified by the State Department as needing resettlement. In practice, the U.S. has a list of qualifying individuals for certain groups, or for other groups, there's an open application process where individuals have to submit evidence showing that they'll meet the group's criteria. Some of these groups actually include individuals in their country of nationality, such as Iraqis who worked for the U.S. government in Iraq. Finally, priority 3 allows refugees and asylees who are already in the U.S. to apply for certain family members abroad to join them. This category is limited to designated nationalities, and these nationalities are determined on an annual basis. To enter through priority 3, the US-based refugee or asylee will have to approach a resettlement agency in the US to start the process. Note that this P3 access point is distinct from another refugee family reunification process known as follow to join. Follow to join allows family members to enter on derivative status, where P3 requires individuals to still prove their own refugee eligibility. Now, regardless of how a refugee accesses the USRAP process, whether it's P1, P2, 3, once they're in the pipeline, they will begin a lengthy series of steps where the US determines their eligibility and admissibility to enter the US as a refugee. So let's walk through those steps. After accessing USRAP, a refugee will first attend an interview with a Resettlement Support Center, an RSC. And it's usually a non-governmental or international organization that contracts with the State Department. The RSC representative will ask the refugee about their refugee claim, get their biographic information, scan any civil documents, and prepare that refugee application. It's at this time that the RSC interview that the US government will start the security checks. Refugees must pass a series of security checks with various government agencies. These checks are run and rerun at different times throughout the process up until the refugee departs for the US. After the RSC interview, a refugee waits for an interview with a US Citizenship and Immigration Services officer. For these interviews to happen, refugee officers usually travel to different areas of the world for short periods of time. So this means that refugees usually have to wait for months and in some cases years for an interview. Note that refugees are barred from bringing a legal representative to an interview, except where required by law. This is in contrast to asylum, where lawyers are allowed to be present in asylum interviews. After the interview, a refugee must wait for their decision. This can take months or in some cases, years, as security checks and other reviews take place. If a refugee is denied, they'll receive a form notice with a checkbox highlighting the reason for their denial. It's with this little information that refugees are allowed 90 days to file a written request for review of that decision. On the other hand, if a refugee is conditionally approved, that means the refugee can now undergo medical screenings and cultural orientation courses. The US government will also arrange for a US-based resettlement agency to take care of a refugee upon arrival, assuring the refugee's basic needs will be handled. This support comes from a combination of US government funding as well as private funds. After all those steps are complete, those 2 interviews, the decision, the medical checks, cultural orientation, assurance, and security checks, refugees can then travel to the United States. This travel happens through a travel loan that the refugee must pay back after arrival. Upon arrival to the US, the resettlement agency that sponsored the refugee will meet the refugee at the airport. This resettlement agency is also responsible for providing basic needs for several months, like shelter, food, and transportation. They must also provide resettlement services like assistance with signing up for benefits, employment counseling, and other social services. After the refugee has been in the States for 1 year, they must apply to adjust their status to that of a lawful permanent resident and receive a green card. Once a refugee has been in the US for 5 years, they have the option of naturalizing and finally becoming a US citizen. So that's the quick overview and the legal framework of processing of the US Refugee Admissions Program. Thanks for listening, and please reach out to Steve and me if you have any questions.